Let's get some more perspective on this development regarding the renewed interest by some Western powers in Africa. Joining me on the news at 10 is former Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi. Ambassador, thank you for joining us on the news at 10.
Thank you for having me here.
You have been monitoring the discussions, you've been observing, you've been making up your mind, you've been developing this discussion up until now. It's a week of diplomatic activity. We saw the British Prime Minister here 2 days ago. Today, it's the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. What do you think is behind this renewed interest in Africa?
First, I think with regards to Africa, I think, number one, they are looking at the demography of the continent. The population of this continent is growing at a very fast pace. And it's beginning to look as if Africa is going to be, not going to be, it's a big, huge market in the making. Secondly is the fact that they're also interested in seeing Africa overcome its own underdevelopment so as to stem the tide of, of migration, which is what they're experiencing. And of course, the trade regime that has, governed the world all over this last couple of years is being disrupted by a number of forces, the Brexit, for example, the Trump trade wars. And you heard the British Prime Minister, saying, what she didn't say properly is that, look, we want to go back to our traditional friends, our traditional trading partners, and by 2022, Britain wants to become one of the largest G7 members to be in the continent, meaning very simply that they've realized that they've lost over the years, and they want to, challenge those who are now doing business in Africa. But it's going to be, a long drawn battle.
So how does Africa now leverage on this renewed interest? How do we make the most of it so that we're not just at the receiving end? Because there are conditions, to these seeming aid that's coming at a certain time.
There's no two ways of doing this. Africa just has to grow up. Africa has to develop and become strong in itself in order to be able to, number one, negotiate with the rest of the world, in order to have something to sell to the rest of the world. There's a lot Africa really needs to begin to do. When you make a comparison between the continent and the Asian continent, for example, and then go back to the 60s or pre-independence, we were rated high in terms of GDP than some of the countries in Asia that have become very developed. So there's no other way. You cannot negotiate from a position of weakness. You cannot be a partner in a game in which, you are not producing much, or you do not have much to sell to your, to the other countries.
But would it have been more of an advantage to us if we had all agreed to that continental free trade agreement? Would we be at a better bargaining position with the UK and the other Western powers?
To a reasonable extent or to a large extent, but the first thing is that individually we need to grow. The continent or the various countries in the region needs to develop. There are a few countries that are doing reasonably well. They are coming up well, and they are in a position to, probably define how they want to engage some of these superpowers. I'm sure you heard, for example, the issue of the second-hand clothing between the Americans and the East Africans. And the East Africans just rejected the American offer. And he said, and because of that, a country like Rwanda was sanctioned by the United States. So when you are in a position of strength like that, you are good to begin to negotiate the terms in which you want to engage your partners.
And then you already mentioned what it would take us, what it would take for Africa to get to this position. But in the end, would the goal be achieved? You mentioned immigration, which is one of the reasons why these leaders are coming, to be able to stem migration. I remember the Spanish Prime Minister did say that leaders need to work more to develop Africa so that more people don't desire to leave. But at the end of the day, do you think that people really would take advantage of this? Would this really stem the tide? If development takes place? Some people's minds are still dead set on, getting to Europe.
No, look, There's what we call a pull factor. There's this mindset, those who want to leave this country, that there's enough job for them outside the country, and that if they go outside the country, they'll probably find things to do, or they've been convinced that Europe or the United States or China or Israel is far better. The opportunities are there for them. Therefore, if you begin to grow, if you begin to develop in this country, and they see the same level of opportunities, they're not going to travel out. The pull factor will reverse almost immediately. So as long as they still believe, and there's this pull factor that attracts people to go to these countries, they will continue to go. And I think this is why some of these leaders are, look, the German Chancellor left Germany with all sorts of, demonstrators, anti-immigrant demonstrators on the streets of Berlin, because this is becoming a big issue to them in that part of the world.
It's also a brain drain for us here. Ambassador Keshi, thank you so much for joining us. Always appreciate your thoughts and, of course, your analysis.
Thank you very much.